September 26, 1983, midnight at the Serpico 15 bunker.
Right, that highly classified Soviet command center hidden just outside Moscow.
Exactly. And the Cold War is at an absolute freezing point. The United States and the Soviet Union are essentially functioning on a hair trigger.
The tension is just, it's unimaginable today.
Unimaginable. And suddenly, the bunker's alarms trigger. The screens just flash this blinding, violent red.
The OK early warning system.
Right, this massive constellation of satellites in these highly elliptical orbits, and it's broadcasting a single, unambiguous message. Launch detected.
Yeah.
5 American Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles are currently in the air. They are arcing across the globe, headed directly for Soviet territory.
And the computer system's decision in that moment is binary. It's absolute nuclear attack confirmed.
Confirmed. And Soviet military doctrine dictates an immediate automated response. Report the launch with the chain of command, initiate the massive counterstrike. In a matter of minutes, hundreds of nuclear warheads will be launched at the United States.
Billions of lives.
Yes.
The entirety of human civilization hanging in the balance of a single, rigid protocol.
But the reason you are alive today to hear this deep dive isn't because of fail-safes. It isn't because of advanced technology. You are alive because one human being actively defied the most powerful system on Earth.
By asking a question the system simply wasn't programmed to ask.
Okay, let's unpack this. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov is staring at this impossible decision. The mainframe is explicitly confirming the attack. The military doctrine, the absolute law of his reality in that moment, demands immediate retaliation.
Right.
But Petrov stops. He notices his own physiological response. He notices the panic, the adrenaline spiking his heart rate, the sheer terror in the room.
Which is completely natural.
Of course. But somehow he manages to separate that localized emotional reality from the structural logical reality. He looks at the data and asks himself a very specific question.
He says, well, if the United States were actually initiating a preemptive nuclear first strike to cripple the Soviet response, why would they only send 5 missiles?
Right. Logically, a first strike would involve thousands of warheads. 5 missiles makes literally no strategic sense.
Exactly. What Petrov exhibited in that excruciatingly tense moment is a cognitive state we refer to as metacognitive intelligence.
Metacognitive intelligence.
Yes, it's this exceedingly rare ability to rationally observe a system from the outside, even while you are physically and psychologically trapped inside of it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The system, in this case, was both the rigid military protocol and the early warning computer network. And he recognized the limitations of that framework. He stepped outside of the prescribed behavioral loop, categorized the alarm as a false positive, and just refused to escalate.
Yeah, and his metacognition was accurate.
Completely accurate. Later analysis revealed the satellite system had essentially hallucinated. The sensors had confused the sun's reflection off high-altitude clouds for the thermal signature of incoming missile plumes.
But wait, I have to push back on the idea that this is just about being smart enough to spot an error. In military structures or government bureaucracies, or really in any massive corporate entity, following the protocol is mathematically the safest bet for the individual.
Oh, absolutely. It's how order is maintained.
Right, and it's how you avoid being court-martialed or fired.
Right.
So why is stepping outside the system, exhibiting this metacognitive intelligence, so extraordinarily difficult for most people? Is it just a fear of authority?
Well, it goes far deeper than a fear of hierarchical authority. What's fascinating here is that we are biologically wired for system blindness.
System blindness.
Yeah. It takes a massive, almost unsustainable amount of metabolic energy to constantly question the framework of your reality. Most people fail to realize that the world does not run on individual, isolated decisions. It runs on emergent systems.
Okay, define what you mean by systems in this context.
Fundamentally, a system is just a repeating combination of loops and rules. If you look at the solar system, it's a gravity loop functioning on the rules of mass and orbital mechanics.
Sure.
If you look at computing, it is an electromagnetic loop. If you look at a nation state, it's a governance loop operating on legal and economic rules. The universe scales through these repeating structures. And we evolved to survive within these loops, not to deconstruct them.
So there is a clear divide here between the drivers of these systems and the passengers.
Precisely. The entities who understand the mechanics of these emergent systems, the elite political strategists, the high-frequency algorithmic trading firms, the engineers designing global tech platforms, they are the drivers.
Because they see the underlying code of the environment.
Exactly. The masses, who suffer from system blindness, are merely the passengers. They move through the world reacting to the outputs of systems they don't even know exist, believing they are making free choices.
Let's ground this with a structural example that everyone listening interacts with daily: the algorithmic environment of social media.
Oh, perfect example.
As a user, you think you're making a conscious free will choice to scroll down, to watch the next reel, to pause on a specific image. But mathematically, an algorithmic system has already calculated the exact probability of your next microaction based on millions of data points from your previous behavioral loops.
Yeah, and it's crucial to understand how it does that. The algorithm isn't merely logging what you like, it is mapping your dopaminergic reward prediction errors.
Reward prediction errors. Okay,
Yeah.
break that down for us.
In neuroscience, a reward prediction error is the difference between the reward you expect and the reward you actually get.
Okay.
When an algorithm delays a highly engaging post and forces you to scroll past 3 mundane posts, it is deliberately manipulating that prediction error to trigger a larger dopamine release when you finally hit the content you want.
So it's withholding the reward to make the eventual hit stronger.
Exactly. Your free will is effectively isolated to a microdecision, while your broader reality is tethered to these deep, invisible loops engineered to extract your attention. It's an external system hacking an internal biological system.
And if you value these kinds of long-form structural breakdowns of how the world actually works, take a second to hit on this deep dive. It really helps us keep bringing you this level of analysis.
It's the only way to beat the algorithms we're talking today.
Exactly. But if we want to truly understand how that internal hacking works, we have to look at the master system running your own life, the human brain's predictive architecture, because it does not work the way we intuitively think it does.
Not at all.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's look at the famous hollow face mask experiment in cognitive science. You take a physical plastic face mask, like a typical Halloween mask.
Right.
If you look at the front of it, it looks like a normal hued face projecting outward toward you. But the experimenters take this mask and rotate it 180 degrees. So now you are looking at the inside of the mask.
The concave side.
Yes, it is curving inward, away from you. But when a human being looks at this completely hollow, inward curving mask, their brain absolutely refuses to see it that way. The viewer perceives it as a normal face projecting outward.
It is one of the most unsettling optical illusions, precisely because it isn't a trick of the light or a forced perspective. It is a fundamental revelation about human cognitive processing.
How so?
For centuries, the prevailing model was that the brain worked like a camera. Light enters the retina, sound hits the tympanic membrane, the signals travel up the optic or auditory nerves, the brain processes the raw data and presents you with a picture of reality.
That's what we're all taught in grade school.
Right. But modern neuroscience, heavily influenced by Carl Friston's free energy principle, suggests the brain does not experience reality directly at all.
It's essentially locked in a dark, silent vault inside your skull. It has no direct access to the outside world.
Exactly. To understand this, we can draw a parallel to how generative AI models, like large language models, function. An AI doesn't actually know anything about the world. It doesn't process objective reality.
Right, it's just predicting tokens.
Yes. It uses vast amounts of historical data to predict the next most mathematically probable token or word in a sequence. The human brain operates on a remarkably similar predictive architecture. It does not process reality from the bottom up. It predicts reality from the top down.
It's simulating.
It generates a continuous simulation of what it expects to happen in the next microsecond, based entirely on your historical data, your past experiences. It then uses your sensory organs merely to check those internal predictions for errors.
So, just like an AI will confidently hallucinate fake legal cases or fake historical events to fill in the gaps in its predictive model, the human brain will literally distort physical reality to make its internal predictions correct.
Precisely. Let's apply the mechanics to the hollow face mask. Your brain has spent its entire existence looking at human faces. In every single instance, a face has projected outward. The mathematical probability of a biological face projecting inward is 0 in your brain's dataset.
Right.
So when the optic nerve sends data to the visual cortex saying, hey, this object is concave, the brain's top-down prediction algorithm evaluates that incoming data and rejects it as a massive sensory error.
It just throws out the actual real-world data.
The predictive model overrides the actual optical data. It hallucinates an outward projecting face, because that minimizes the surprise or the free energy in the system, Reality is literally distorted to serve the prediction.
And this extends far beyond visual tricks. It dictates our actual physical
Oh,
biology.
absolutely.
Take the rubber hand illusion. Participants sit at a table, their real hand is hidden behind a screen, and a fake rubber hand is placed in front of them. The researcher strokes both the hidden real hand and the visible fake hand simultaneously with a brush.
The brain quickly updates its predictive model to adopt the rubber hand as its own.
Exactly, because the visual data of the brush matching the tactile sensation creates a new localized reality. But then the researcher suddenly smashes the fake rubber hand with a hammer.
And the participants don't just flinch.
No. Functional MRI scans show their brain's pain matrix lights up, and they register actual physical pain. The hammer never touched their biological body. But the brain predicted the physical trauma, and so the body manifested the physiological sensation of trauma.
Hmm. It's the exact same neurobiological mechanism underlying the placebo effect.
Really, the exact same mechanism.
Yes. If you give a patient a biologically inert sugar pill, but the clinical environment, the doctor's authority, the sterile room, the medical terminology convinces them it's a highly advanced new drug, the brain's predictive model assumes physiological healing is imminent.
So it forces the body to match the expectation.
Exactly. Because the brain controls the descending pain modulatory system, it actively suppresses pain signals in the spinal cord before they even reach conscious awareness. It predicts a drop in blood pressure, and so it dilates the blood vessels.
That's incredible.
The objective reality of the sugar pill is entirely irrelevant to the body. The simulation of the medicine becomes the biological truth.
Okay, wait. I have to push back here. I understand the mechanics of how the hallucination happens, but this feels like a massive, catastrophic evolutionary design flaw.
How so?
Well, if the brain's ultimate driving goal is the physical survival of the organism, why would it deliberately deceive us? If I hallucinate that a concave surface is convex, or I hallucinate that a fake hand is my real hand, my model of reality is completely decoupled from the actual objective physical truth.
Right.
In a survival scenario, an inaccurate model of reality gets you killed. Why wouldn't evolution simply select for brains that continuously update to match the objective physical truth of the world?
That is the natural logical assumption, but it ignores the fundamental constraint of biological economics. Updating your internal model of reality requires processing new, conflicting data from the bottom up.
Which takes energy.
An immense amount of metabolic energy. The brain is an absolute energy hog. It makes up only about 2% of your total body weight, but it consumes 20% of your daily caloric intake just to maintain baseline operations. Constantly updating reality in real time is metabolically ruinous.
But surely the cost of being wrong is higher than the cost of burning a few extra calories. I mean, if you hallucinate that a predator isn't in the bushes because you didn't expect one to be there, energy conservation doesn't matter because you're dead.
Right, but evolution doesn't select for perfect objective accuracy. It selects for good enough survival. The brain operates on a principle of efficiency. If predicting the all faces project outward is correct 99.9% of the time, the metabolic savings of not having to meticulously calculate the depth of every face you see over an entire lifetime, that far outweighs the minor risk of being momentarily confused by a hollow mask.
Okay, that makes sense. It's playing the odds.
Exactly. The brain vastly prefers stable, predictable patterns because they are cheap to run. And this brings us to the most critical mechanism of all. If we connect this to the bigger picture, to conserve energy, the brain compresses all of our distinct behavioral loops, our fear loops, our dopaminergic reward systems, and our social positioning into one highly efficient, centralized operating system. We call that centralized predictive model identity.
Identity.
Yeah.
So we need to stop thinking of identity as some abstract philosophical concept or an aesthetic label we choose to express ourselves.
Yes.
Identity is a biological energy-saving mechanism. It acts as the ultimate filter of reality. And the terrifying implication here is that the structural decisions we make in our lives, who we marry, what career we choose, who we vote for, might not be our own logical free will conclusions at all.
No, they might merely be the automated outputs of our identity filter working overtime to protect its own internal predictions and save metabolic energy.
That's a lot to process.
It is precisely what it is. Identity is the master predictive model. It dictates what information is allowed to pass through the cognitive filter and what is rejected as a sensory or logical error.
So it's actively sorting data based on what aligns with the identity.
Right. When new information aligns with the established identity, it requires almost zero energy to process. It is accepted seamlessly. But when information contradicts the core identity, it is not merely perceived as a factual inaccuracy. It is perceived as a literal biological threat to the system's structural integrity.
Let's look at the absolute gold standard case study for this, which perfectly illustrates how intelligence is hijacked by identity. The famous cultural cognition study, often referred to as the law school experiment.
Oh, this study's brilliant.
It is. Researchers took a group of highly numerate individuals, people with exceptionally high mathematical and statistical abilities. They gave them a very complex, dense statistical problem to solve.
A 2x2 contingency table.
Right. They framed the data as a medical study, testing whether a new skin cream was effective at curing rashes. The data was deliberately tricky. The absolute numbers suggested the cream worked, but if you actually calculated the ratios of success to failure, the data definitively proved the skin cream made the rashes worse.
And because these participants were highly intelligent, they engaged their prefrontal cortexes, ran the complex covariance calculations, and correctly deduced that the skin cream was ineffective.
In that instance, their high cognitive capacity was functioning exactly as we assume intelligence functions, as an objective tool for parsing reality and arriving at the mathematical truth.
Exactly.
But then the researchers took the exact same underlying data set, the exact same numbers, the exact same mathematical relationships and ratios, but they changed the labels on the contingency table.
They made it political.
Yes. Instead of skin cream and rashes, the data was now labeled to represent the highly charged topic of gun control, specifically testing whether banning concealed carry laws reduces crime. When the exact same mathematical formula was applied to an issue inextricably tied to political identity, the smartest participants in the study failed spectacularly.
And it is vital to emphasize that the failure in this study was completely structurally bipartisan. We're presenting this entirely neutrally because the data spared no one.
Right, everyone failed.
When the numbers objectively showed that gun control failed to reduce crime, the highly intelligent Democrats in the study suddenly lost their ability to execute basic statistical analysis. They evaluated the data incorrectly to support their pre-existing belief that guns cause crime.
And the reverse was true as well.
Exactly. Conversely, when the numbers in the table were flipped to objectively show that gun control did reduce crime, the highly intelligent Republicans suddenly failed the math test, misinterpreting the data to prove that an armed populace reduces crime.
It's staggering. Their intelligence didn't help them find the truth. In fact, if I recall the data correctly, the higher the individual's math skills, the more violently they distorted the data to fit their political bias.
Exactly. Their intelligence was actively weaponized against the truth. This shatters the myth that education and raw IQ inherently lead to more objective worldviews. When the master predicted model, their political identity was threatened by raw data, their prefrontal cortex was not used to update their worldview. Their high IQs were drafted into service to defend the identity. They used their massive cognitive processing power to invent complex, highly sophisticated rationalizations for why the math must mean what they wanted it to mean.
This explains the structural mechanics of global power dynamics so clearly. I mean, it explains why political corruption often goes entirely unpunished by an electorate, so long as the corrupt politician plays effectively into the identity politics of their base.
The voter isn't evaluating the corruption, they're protecting their identity model.
It's why pure logic essentially never wins a religious, ideological, or political debate. The debate isn't actually an exchange of logical propositions.
No, what you are witnessing in those debates is a fight for neurological survival. To the brain, a threat to its identity model is indistinguishable from a threat to its physical survival.
Because if the identity collapses,
If the identity collapses, the predictive model collapses. If the predictive model collapses, the organism doesn't know how to navigate the world, how to predict social interactions, or how to secure resources. The biological result is profound allostatic load, a state of chronic, damaging stress. Panic ensues.
let's go deeper into the physical neuroscience of this. You're saying this isn't just behavioral psychology, this is tangible, measurable brain architecture.
Yes, identity is a physical neural network, primarily involving three distinct regions working in a continuous feedback loop. First, you have the default mode network, or the DMN.
Okay, the DMN, what does that do?
This is a network of interacting brain regions, including the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. It is highly active when you are awake, but not focused on the outside world. This is the biological seat of your self story.
The narrator in your head.
Exactly. It's the narrator that constantly weaves your memories, your perceived traits, and your future simulations into a cohesive narrative of who you are. Second, you have the basal ganglia.
The engine room for automated behavior.
Right. It takes the narrative from the DMN and encodes it into physical actions and habits you don't have to consciously think about.
Hmm.
And finally, you have the amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure deep in the temporal lobe, which operates as the brain's rapid response threat detection center.
So let's trace the pathway. When someone challenges your deeply held political belief, or critiques your core parenting style, or presents data that invalidates your economic worldview, what actually happens in that network?
The incoming data reaches the brain. The default mode network immediately registers a massive contradiction between the external data and the internal self story. It flags this as a critical prediction error.
A system failure.
Right, but because updating the DMN would require tearing down and rebuilding the neural pathways of your identity, which again is metabolically ruinous, the DMN instead alerts the amygdala.
The threat center.
The amygdala interprets this cognitive dissonance as a mortal threat. It triggers what we call an amygdala hijack. It signals the hypothalamus, which floods the body with cortisol and adrenaline. Crucially, this stress response actively suppresses the neural pathways to the prefrontal cortex, the logical reasoning part of your brain.
So you literally, physically lose access to your rationality.
Yes. Questioning your identity threatens the entire neural structure with a catastrophic collapse. Rebuilding an identity from scratch requires an astronomical amount of energy. So the brain takes the highly efficient, energy-saving shortcut.
It fills the gaps.
It fills the gaps in its worldview with cognitive biases, with selective attention, and with aggressive high IQ rationalization. It preserves the structure of the identity at the absolute cost of the truth.
I want you to pause for a second and really think about the deeply held beliefs that structure your life. The political stances you defend, your career ambitions, your judgments about how society should operate, how much of that worldview is actually genuinely yours?
That's the real question.
And how much of it was actively chosen by your own rigorous logical deduction from a state of total neutrality? And how much of it is just societal programming, the beliefs of your parents, the economic class of your hometown, the algorithms you interacted with in your early 20s that installed itself before you even knew how to build a firewall? And now your biological hardware is violently defending it just to save metabolic energy. Let us know in the comments where you've noticed this system blindness in your own life. Recognizing that in yourself is incredibly uncomfortable.
It is the ultimate intellectual discomfort. But traversing that discomfort is the absolute prerequisite for achieving actual intelligence.
Which brings us to the trajectory of all of this. If we are biologically trapped in these predictive loops, if our brains are physically wired to filter reality, to protect our pre-installed identities. So what does this all mean? How do we break out of this? How do we achieve what the sources describe as level 1 adaptive intelligence?
To understand the mechanics of the solution, we have to look at the macro scale of evolutionary history. Specifically, we need to look back about 2.4 billion years to a period known as the Great Oxidation Event.
Okay, taking us way back.
Way back. For the anaerobic life forms that existed on Earth at that time, oxygen was a highly lethal, corrosive poison. When cyanobacteria began producing massive quantities of oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis, it triggered a global mass extinction.
The atmosphere literally became toxic to the existing systems of life.
Exactly. But a new type of biological system evolved. It didn't just survive the oxygen, it fundamentally altered its internal metabolic processes to utilize that lethal poison as its primary high-yield fuel source.
They adapted their internal structure to match the new external reality.
Exactly. Every complex human being alive today, every sprawling ecosystem, every advanced mammalian brain exists because of that single structural pivot. Those adapting organisms were not smarter in any quantifiable metric. They couldn't compute data faster, but they possessed the ultimate evolutionary trait, morphological and metabolic adaptability.
So if we apply that to the cognitive level, we have to completely redefine what true intelligence actually means. Reality doesn't care about your capacity to solve a 2x2 contingency table. It doesn't care about your ability to memorize historical dates. Reality only gives adaptation tests.
That's it.
The highest form of intelligence, level 1 adaptive intelligence, is the capacity to maintain a fluid, flexible identity. It is the ability to overwrite your internal predictive model faster than the external world changes without triggering an amygdala hijack.
This concept echoes the deepest insights of ancient philosophy, now validated by modern neuroscience. Gautama Buddha famously noted that the root of human suffering is attachment.
Right.
Translated into a neuroscientific context, that suffering is generated by rigid attachment to the default mode network's identity narrative. When the external world fundamentally changes, an economic collapse, a technological paradigm shift, a geopolitical upheaval, but your internal predictive model violently refuses to update to reflect that new reality, the friction between those two states is what we physically experience as psychological suffering.
But here's the structural trap, and I want you to listen to this very carefully. Simply hearing this information, simply understanding the mechanics of the default mode network and the amygdala will not change your behavior. The research is brutal on this point.
It really is.
A vast majority of people who learn about cognitive biases and system blindness fail to overcome them. They fall into the trap of thinking, okay, I understand how my brain hallucinates reality, therefore I am now immune to it. But identity is not a conceptual problem you can solve with a motivational epiphany. Identity is a structural, biological feedback loop.
Precisely. You cannot dismantle a physical neural network with a motivational quote or a single moment of profound realization. You have to actively engineer a new loop to replace the old loop. And the scientific literature provides very precise three-step mechanical process for overriding the default mode network and developing level 1 adaptive intelligence.
Step 1 is the installation of an adaptive mindset, specifically utilizing the mathematics of Bayesian inference.
Bayesian inference is a method of statistical updating. It requires moving completely away from absolute certainties and binary beliefs, and instead evaluating reality purely in terms of probabilities. Let's look at how this operates at the highest levels of global innovation.
Like Elon Musk.
Exactly.
Oh.
Regardless of your personal views on his politics or corporate governance, Elon Musk's cognitive framework is intensely Bayesian. When his companies attempt to land a reusable rocket and the rocket explodes on the launch pad in a massive fireball, the rigid identity response would be to view this as an ego-destroying failure.
Right. The amygdala would trigger shame, and the DMN would try to rationalize the failure to protect the ego.
But a Bayesian mind does not view ideas or engineered systems as extensions of the self. They are hypotheses tested against reality. The explosion is simply a new, highly valuable data point that updates the prior probability matrix. The internal model adjusts immediately to incorporate the new data.
Let's scale that down to a deeply personal, relatable example from the source material. Think about the self-imposed limitation, I am bad at public speaking, or I am naturally terrible at mathematics. If you hold that as a rigid, static identity within your default mode network, your brain will physically ensure that prediction comes true.
It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Your amygdala will spike cortisol before you even open your mouth to speak, ruining your cognitive recall. But if you apply Bayesian updating, you reframe the identity as a hypothesis. You force yourself to speak publicly. It goes terribly, but you don't process it as, I'm a failure. You process it as a data point.
Right. You adjust your preparation and you do it again.
It goes slightly better. You iteratively test and update the belief until your neural pathways physically rewire and the identity shifts from I am fundamentally incapable of this to I am an individual who is currently developing this skill. You turn a rigid biological wall into a permeable membrane.
Which brings us to step 2 of the process. And this is where individualistic approaches almost always fail. Environment architecture. We have a deep cultural bias toward believing that identity is forged by an individual's iron will, functioning in isolation. But rigorous sociological and neuroscientific data demonstrates that identity is shaped far more aggressively by the external social environment than by internal logic.
Your brain mirrors the systems you inhabit.
Exactly. And the mechanism here involves the mirror neuron system and the human evolutionary imperative for tribal cohesion. We are social primates. Survival outside the group historically meant death. Therefore, the brain heavily rewards conformity to the immediate social environment with dopamine and oxytocin.
Which explains military boot camps.
This is why global militaries operate the way they do. They don't just teach recruits how to shoot. They strip away civilian clothing, enforce identical haircuts, and isolate the recruits in a highly controlled boot camp environment. They are rapidly destroying the old environmental cues to starve the old identity, while simultaneously using group pressure to forge a new, highly disciplined identity model.
It's structural rebuilding.
Exactly. It's the same reason why startup ecosystems in places like Silicon Valley or Shenzhen breed such immense risk takers. The external environment actively normalizes failure, shifting the baseline predictions of the internal brain.
Look at the public health data on behavioral change for proof of this. When an individual tries to quit smoking or drastically change their dietary habits entirely on their own, relying purely on the prefrontal cortex to exert willpower against the deeply entrenched habits of the basal ganglia, the success rate is incredibly grim. Statistically, it hovers around 5 to 8%. The old loops eventually overpower the conscious intent.
Am. But observe what happens when they engineer the environment. When that exact same individual joins a structured cessation community or immerses themselves in a social group where the new desired identity is the baseline norm, the success rate jumps dramatically to 15 to 25%.
Wow.
That is a 2 to 3 times increase in behavioral modification simply by altering the external social inputs. You cannot sustain a new identity in an environment that constantly structurally reinforces the old one. If you want to change your internal loops, you must physically change the external systems you interact with.
Which leads perfectly into the final mechanical component, step 3, repeated behavior, driven by the psychological framework of self-perception theory. This is the ultimate twist in how the brain works, and understanding it gives you the keys to the kingdom. We intuitively assume that our actions are the downstream result of our identity.
We think the identity comes first.
Right. The logic goes, I am a healthy person, therefore I choose to go to the gym. I am an intellectual person, therefore I read dense books. But Daryl Bem's self-perception theory, backed by modern behavioral science, suggests the brain's predictive architecture actually works in reverse. We do not discover our identity by looking deep within our souls. We infer our identity by passively observing our own repeated physical actions, the exact same way a stranger would observe us.
It is the ultimate bottom-up feedback loop, tricking the top-down predictive model. If your brain observes your physical body sitting on the couch, endlessly scrolling through algorithmically sorted social media feeds for 4 hours every night, the default mode network processes that behavioral data and calmly concludes, the physical organism behaves this way repeatedly. Therefore, our identity is that of a passive consumer.
And it locks it in.
It then hardwires that identity, making it harder to break out the next day. But if you engineer a system where your brain observes your body, picking up a complex book for 20 minutes every single morning, regardless of your internal motivation, the brain evaluates that physical data. It slowly updates the predictive model. The organism reads daily. Therefore, I am a learner, I am a reader. The physical behavior must precede the cognitive identity.
So if we synthesize this vast architecture of neuroscience, cognitive bias, and behavioral psychology into a ruthless practical blueprint, we arrive at the identity journal concept. It is not about journaling your feelings. It is a mechanical engineering process for your brain. Number 1, you explicitly define the desired identity. You don't write down a goal like, I want to lose 20 pounds. You write the systemic identity, I am an athlete.
Right, focus on the system.
Number 2, you relentlessly record daily behavioral evidence that proves this identity to your brain. Did you walk for 10 minutes? Write it down. Did you choose water over soda? Write it down. Every entry is a mathematical data point, forcing the predictive model to update. Number 3, you conduct a structural gap analysis.